Hello and welcome to today's webinar of CAS Inspire on connected learning in computing, putting the best of blended teaching into practice. My name is Wendy Piccinini and I am the CAS Community Outreach Manager for communities across London and the East of England. I'm your host for this session. I'm also joined by my colleague Tim Wilson, who is Outreach Manager for the Midlands and some communities in the Southwest. Tim will be moderating today's session and bringing your questions to today's panel. This webinar is part of the CAS Inspire series. CAS Inspire is a series of resources consisting of live webinars with expert panelists discussing topical computing education matters in which the audience can get involved. Also featured are videos teaching computing concepts, podcasts and careers inspiration webinars. During the session, please use the question window on the right-hand side of your screen to ask questions. All attendees are in listen-only mode. The top of the window has an orange rectangle which can be expanded or collapsed. If you would like to download a copy of this webinar and/or the slide deck, both will be available on the CAS website in due course. If using social media, the hashtag for the event is #CasInspire. During the webinar, please type any questions into the question window, and at the end of the session, if time allows, Tim will pose questions to the presenters then. So without further ado, I will introduce the panel. This afternoon, I'm delighted to be joined by Sarah Horrocks, Rowan Roberts and Peter Lillington from the London Connected Learning Centre team. Sarah is the Director of the London Connected Learning Centre as part of the Education Development Trust. She has significant experience of leading powerful professional development of teachers, supporting schools in using digital technologies and working with school leaders to develop their digital strategies. Rowan specialises in primary computing, as well as the use of technology to support learning across all subject areas. She's worked nationally and internationally on projects aimed at developing effective and inclusive pedagogy in computer science, particularly through block-based programming language Scratch. Rowan has been teaching workshops and staff training sessions at the CLC for several years and is currently also leading on the production of BlendEd's on-demand courses, as well as many of their other online teaching and learning materials. Peter is an experienced teacher, hands-on workshop facilitator for all ages, course author for Teacher CPD, subject specialist and consultant for computing curriculum and creative technology enhanced learning. Working also at a strategic level, he is an assessor for the NACE mark and 360 Safe Quality marks, with many other accreditations relevant in the field of EdTech. He currently has a special interest in online safety and critical literacy and the pedagogy of computational thinking for young children. So without further ado, I will hand over to the panel for this afternoon's session, and I will share the presentation with you. Bear with me while I share my screen. We can get started. Okay. There we go.
Thank you, Wendy and Tim. Okay, so we're going to be talking about computing, connected learning and blended learning. So who are we? Who is the Connected Learning Centre? You will be hearing more from my colleagues Peter Lillington and Rowan Roberts this afternoon, as just introduced by Wendy. We're also part of a bigger team And Wendy, if you go to the next slide, we can see the lovely bunch of colleagues that we work with, so made up of teachers and technicians. And just thinking a bit about...
a few issues.
Sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, let me try again. Right, there we go.
Okay, there we go. There we are. There's our lovely bunch of colleagues. And then if you could go on to the next slide, Wendy, that would be great. So you'll see there that our tagline is extraordinary learning with and about technology, and we think that that's there's a significant difference to those things, and we're going to be talking today about that kind of learning with and about. And we're also really interested in this term connected learning. If you could go to the next slide, Wendy. And we made a kind of deliberate move about it. Some of you may have known us when we were previously called Lambeth City Learning Centre, but we made a very deliberate move around renaming ourselves the Connected Learning Centre. And connected learning is really this intersection between kind of academic, real world, home, community, passions and interests. And we've drawn a bit from the Connected Learning Alliance in the US, and we like some of the statements that they have. We feel that it describes the work that we do very well. So this idea, as I said, about kind of rooting what we do, the support that we do with schools, the activities we do with children, the professional development we do with teachers, the special projects that we do in the real world, often in a kind of cultural or work-related learning or business setting. And we, linking a bit to our idea of kind of extraordinary learning, we love this idea of kind of, you know, technology being in the service of powerful learning, not being led by the technology. We're absolutely kind of technology agnostic, and we really support this kind of notion of young people's kind of interests as well as their academic success. And significantly for our talk today, we're going to be focusing on making, creating and producing with technology. And then we've been really lucky to be involved in a project this year called Blended. And we were fortunate to be provided with some support from IBM's charitable trust. And this website, this kind of gathering of resources and learning is all about supporting teachers in blended learning pedagogies. We know that since the pandemic, we've all had to learn new ways of teaching and learning. But blended learning, of course, was a thing before the pandemic, very much about how you combine technology with face-to-face teaching in the classroom, with online, how you effectively support technology, support learning using technology. And our blended site is very much a kind of pulling together of micro learning. So there are very, very short bite-sized asynchronous courses. There are live events like today's event in partnership with Computing at School is part of our blended live programme. And we've also got stories from teachers, short clips of teachers talking about how they've been using technology, how they've been adapting and changing through the pandemic, how they've been building on their expertise and how they're changing as they go back into the classroom, and how they're using their kind of new skills and expertise. So please do check out Blended. And then on to the next slide.
Sorry, Sarah, there's a slight delay. I have moved it on. There we go.
Okay.
Between me clicking and appearing. Sorry, go with me.
Yeah, and do let me know, Wendy. So we're just, yeah, this is the world of hybrid and blended, isn't it? So this is just a screenshot from the website where you can see some of the sorts of themes that we're covering, so things like metacognition or questioning, feedback and assessment, using technology in specific subject areas. So I would really recommend people to have a look at that site. And then moving on, we're now going to be talking about the computing curriculum. So I know that the audience are absolute experts in the computing curriculum, steeped in the computing curriculum, and don't need reminding that we have 3 strands: IT, digital literacy, and computer science. And Rowan, Peter, and myself are going to be taking a strand each this afternoon as we talk to you. So I always think it's always worthwhile going back to those programs of study. So thinking about the IT part of the computing curriculum, you know, that it does include things like understanding about search technologies. It does understand things like kind of collecting and analysing data and evaluating and presenting information. So it's kind of the full gamut, really, of how we use technology. And one of our former colleagues, Joe Halloran, who used to have the same role that Peter and Rowan now have, he loved computer science, and he loved programming so much that he's now gone to Google to be a programmer. But when the computing curriculum came in 2014, and he was explaining the 3 strands to teachers, he always used to talk about the IT strand as being using stuff to make stuff. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've been encouraging children and young people to use stuff to make stuff. As I said earlier, we try to root what we do in a kind of real world context, and we over the years have had a lot of programs and projects working in partnership with cultural organisations such as Tate. And we've been involved for many years in a program called Tate Exchange, where each year we get to take over the 5th floor of the Tate Gallery in London, taking 200 children there to get involved in digital making, in kind of arts-based creative activities. The children visit the gallery, they make gallery tours, they respond to the art, and they become artists themselves. So, of course, this year, with the closure of Tate and schools in lockdown, the majority of children learning from home, we weren't able to do that. Then when they came back into school, we wanted to put something together that was going to be really exciting, that took some of the kind of the best of that program. So we put together a virtual program where we had those 200 children meeting together in real time, but doing some activities beforehand, some kind of deep digital making activities, and then presenting to each other, critiquing. If you could go on to the next slide, Wendy, you'll see a Padlet of the choice of activities that they were able to do at the live part of the session, doing preparation beforehand.
It's coming up.
Okay, great. And then on to the next one, which is just some screenshots. So they did some tours based on Street View and Google Maps of their favourite places. They made digital art galleries in Scratch. They used Chrome Music Lab. They they did videos talking about artists' work, and they created their own work and created their own galleries. So that's an example of one of our blended projects where we've brought together those different elements, and the kind of excitement of children talking to children in other classes live. And we had a similar model for a project that we have done this year with Westminster Abbey. We were hoping that the classes would be able to go to the Abbey to find out about famous people that are memorialised there or buried there. But instead we made it into a blended approach. So we had to make sure that the teachers first were really skilled in teaching filmmaking. So we had a kind of a filmmaking training, and also provided a Padlet for the teachers with lots and lots of resources, materials about those historical figures. And then the children were able to work over quite a period of time in depth as a class with all of those IT aspects. So they were having to make choices, they were having to learn about kind of uploading and editing and selection and kind of folder structures, all sorts of skills that they were using green screen. And they also made future memorials about people that they think should be deserving of being memorialised at the Abbey. So again, this was a fantastic way to have that in-depth making, and then that opportunity for children to present, to have an audience of peers that they could present to. And again, they critiqued, they asked questions of each other. And we're going to have a look at one of their films. And fingers crossed that the audio works. And so I'll stop now, Wendy, and then wait for the film to come up. Yeah, so there's the Padlet of the resources.
Yes, thank you.
And then the next one will be the film itself.
I think it will catch up with me in a moment. Bear with us. There we go.
But what makes this man so special? What makes his memoir, first published in 1789, such an important anchor in history? Watch on to find out. Born in Benin, which historians believe is modern-day Nigeria, Equian reports in his autobiography that his father was one of the tribe. When he was only 11 years old, the same age as me, he and his sister were tragically kidnapped and sold into enslavement. Enslavement. Now, the action of making someone a slave. In his own words, Equian. One day, when all of our people were out to their works as usual, and only I and my dear sister turned the house. Two men and a woman got over our woods, and in a moment seized us both. They stopped us mouse, ran off with us into the nearest wood. Equiana was a and we went thousands of other Africans along the Atlantic Ocean to the New World. But don't be fooled. This was not an endurable boat trip. Africans were densely packed onto the ship. The voyage took 3 to 4 months, and during this time, the enslaved people lay chained on the floor and around the ship's hand. Did you know approximately 2 million enslaved Africans tragically did not survive the journey across the Passage? When Equiano reached the New World, by Captain Michael Henry Pascal made. When he reached the New World, he was renamed Gustavus Vassa after the 16th century famous street, Gustus Vassa. During his enslavement with Pascal, Equiano had to read.
Wendy, as we're having some buffering, shall we leave it there, and we can give people the links to the full range of all the different films that were made by the many schools involved.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. It was playing perfectly on my screen, but I can see the lag. So yeah, I think we'll move on.
But hopefully we get a flavour of that. So that was just a little bit of a taste of some of the things that we've been doing in terms of blended and IT. And now I'm going to hand over to Peter, who's going to talk about digital literacy.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, so this is another important aspect of what we do, and around alongside all our work around online safety, which, if you like, is part of our bread and butter, we've developed some more particular expertise as well. We know that terminology can sometimes be confusing, and particularly the term digital literacy can mean very many things to many people. It certainly includes the online safety elements, but we think it goes a bit further, and perhaps some of this has evolved and become definitely a heightened need since the launch of the computing curriculum in 2014. A recent report from the Institute of Education and UCL, which was commissioned by Since 9/11, the UK education charity, entitled addressing extremism through the classroom was picked up by national media last week and includes sections on shifting online, blurring boundaries between inside and outside of school, and the challenge of remote learning in a pandemic. So Wendy, are you able to just go back to the previous slide for a moment? Thank you. And this definitely is high, thank you very much. This is definitely high stakes subject matter. And also at the moment, we know for the majority of the population, where they get their medical information, whether that's from social media, personal messaging, or reputable medical sources is kind of critical. And undoubtedly the subject categories that we've got at the side of the slide there are very germane here and show the complexity of this aspect. And we know the government's taking more measures too. Over the summer, the DCMS launched their digital media literacy strategy, and online harms legislation is coming in too. And as you're aware, I'm sure everyone in this call, online safety education has got an ever increasing prominence year on year in keeping children safe in education. And at a time of remote and blended learning with stresses on children, families and staff alike, we do well to be aware of the social and emotional aspects of learning too, even if that acronym of SEAL isn't so much used these days. And I know that a resource probably that people are very familiar with, the Education for Connected World framework, is a great way of making these links between subjects that are sometimes in danger of becoming compartmentalized. And I'm just quoting from the CAS NACE Guide to Computing Curriculum back in 2014, and it says, pupils have an opportunity to develop a more critical media literacy as they work with tools that until relatively recently were the domain of professionals. And definitely for us, one of the ways in which we understand this digital literacy is in effect akin to language learning. Pupils develop fluency by actually doing and using. And at the CLC, as you've already heard in the IT section, we always seek to involve pupils' creativity and creating, not consuming, as the mantra goes. So moving on to the next slide now, please. So I guess this sets the context for our very specific project that I want to talk about now, our news project. Briefly outlining its evolution, I'm going to talk about its most recent blended incarnation. So about 4 years ago at the CLC, we were successfully running our fake news workshops with Key Stage 2 pupils. We don't really favour that terminology any longer, but these combined all three strands of the computing curriculum with some simple creative HTML programming, and they were really popular. And around that time, the all-party parliamentary group on literacy had launched their commission on fake news and the teaching of critical literacy in schools. One of the questions that sought to answer was, are new skills and resources needed to deal with the digital news environments? We felt there were links to be made and a curriculum context to be developed beyond simple online safety do's and don'ts. And at that time, Google gave some funding to a very successful collaboration called Newswise that involved the Guardian Foundation, the National Literacy Trust and the PSAG Association. And that's still going strong, and some great resources there that we'd recommend. And out of Newswise came a wider news literacy network with a number of organisations, and we've been really pleased to be actively participating in that for 3 years. And a number of those organisations there have developed resources and programmes for schools. Next, please. So our particular project, which is a collaboration with First News Education, is aimed at Year 5 students, and it has a 5-week duration with at least once a week lesson involving a range of news materials, some of which are digital. Not only are the students reading the news, but they're also writing it, they're discussing it, and in the culminating project, they're making actual editorial decisions which are reflected in the real life issue of the children's newspaper, which very many schools subscribe to. And that editorial activity takes place in the special event. And in the first year of our project, it happened at our centre in Clapham with about 40 students. But in our 2020 version, with its blended approach, we were able to extend that to around 500 pupils participating in the whole project and in the final event. And the project is based on a model developed by First News Education colleague Nicolette Smalshaw with UCL and the Institute of Education to develop a community of news-savvy students who understand where news comes from and beginning to understand how it's validated. Next slide, please. So you'll see some of the enthusiastic responses from pupils and teachers alike from last autumn, and we're embarking on something similar again this year. Hopefully you'll see that slide in a moment, and then on to the next one after that, please, Wendy.
Sorry, Peter, this seems to have frozen.
That's okay. Oh, here it is. Great. So there's some of our Twitter responses and our blog, which if you're interested, you can follow up on and read further. And then the next slide briefly outlines. So what was common to the first in-person event at our centre and our blended event, where you'll see the launch event and the activity in schools and the range, and enthusiastic feedback for both versions. And then the next slide, the final one for this project, just highlights how we kind of evolved and refined the project and actually managed to reach many more students. So we were really pleased with that, and as we run the project coming up shortly, launching in October, we're going to do a further evolution of that blended version. And now, as a bridge to our next section, so next slide please, I'm just going to say a few words about another of our projects, this time one that involves schools and colleagues in 5 other countries. And Co-Make, as it's called, follows on from its predecessor, Co-Think, which was focused on computational thinking in primary. But this project starts with the foundations and is focused on how computational thinking figures in early years. And within the project, there are simultaneous periods of in-school activity, which are called learnathons, and those are thematic. And Learnathon 1 at the start of the project involved stories and play around first contact between a child and a question mark robot. So next slide will show the Co-Make logo, and you'll see those 2 characters there. And that was exploring how they might communicate, perhaps in words, perhaps through gestures, perhaps through symbols or sounds, and perhaps they'd have to take it in turns. And then Learnathon 2 was around pattern recognition and pattern making, and that's both in school, at home perhaps, and in the natural environment. And then Learnathon 3 was about movement, dance and instructions, and of necessity throughout the project we had to introduce a blended element, and that's been strengthened, and that included pupils' communication class to class by live video. And you might have glanced, we had the schedule on the previous slide for a successful live on Zoom 12 class international extravaganza with a performance of sequenced actions and music across 5 countries, which was part of our online conference last year. And in Learnathon 4, which is coming up shortly, that's going to be the first actual simple programming for many of the schools and settings, whether that's using robots or an app like Scratch Junior. So on that note, I'm handing over to Rowan.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, and so Peter and Sarah have talked a little bit already about some of the ways in which we've kind of had to adapt the ways that we've used technology, and also the types of technology that we've used in the ways that we've been teaching IT and digital literacy this year. But one thing that I think has been really interesting in terms of thinking about computer science has been that actually what I have ended up leaning on a lot and using most in my practice have been the tools that I've found to be the most adaptable. So the tools that haven't actually required me to use a different tool to solve the same problem, because they can be used in lots of different ways depending on the teaching context that you're working with, whether you are remote and your class are in school, whether your class are all at home and you're teaching them at a distance, or whether you happen to be in the same room together. And so the thing that I found myself leaning on probably more than anything else, and this was true before, but it's even more true now, is using Scratch. And I think part of the reason that Scratch is such a great tool when we're having to kind of be quite flexible about how we're teaching and having a mind to the possibility that we might have to do things a bit differently, is just the fact that it's cross-platform and it's free and you can access it from a web browser. So as long as you've got access to the internet and you have some kind of device, you'll have some level of access to Scratch, hopefully. Obviously the type of activity that you do might vary a little bit. If you know that you've got a lot of people accessing Scratch from an iPad, for example, you're probably not going to want to do a computer game activity where you have to use the arrow keys to move your character around. But in general, it's pretty accessible from a lot of different devices, and that's been really, really helpful. But I think that there are also some particular features of Scratch that we've found ourselves actually, they've always been there, or not always, but they've been there for a long time, and we found ourselves actually really making good use of them a lot more than we were before. And so I'm going to talk about a few of those. So if we go on to the next slide, I'm going to be talking about a few of those different features today. And the one that I wanted to start off with is the remix function in Scratch. So those of you who are quite familiar with Scratch have probably remixed a project or two here and there. But if you haven't used it before, basically, if you're logged into Scratch and you open up someone else's Scratch project, you can click the remix button at the top, and it basically just makes a copy of it that saves to your own projects. So we've used remixing in a few different ways this year. I think part of the reason that it's really, really helpful from a kind of like pedagogy point of view, just go back to the previous slide, is this idea of there being a kind of continuum of scaffolding in computing. And you might be familiar with that term if you've read Jane Waite's work, which a lot of which is shared on the Computing at School website. So I think this particular continuum diagram is actually shared on a CAS post, and she talks a lot about the idea that you can structure activities in different ways to allow a different level of scaffolding to be present in your activity. And that might be something that a lot of you as CAS members have been thinking about for a long time, and have been thinking about a lot in terms of classroom practice. But I think what's been really interesting about the last year and a half is that we've had to find ways of thinking about different levels of scaffolding while also thinking about completely different ways of teaching. And that has created a real challenge, but I think it's also given me personally an opportunity to think quite carefully about how I structure activities and how I kind of provide that scaffolding. So just like, I won't go into loads of detail about these. Read the blog post if you want to hear exactly what is meant by each of these terms. But this spectrum kind of going all the way from copy code, being basically where you tell the children which blocks they might need to create their program, all the way across to tinkering, where it's a lot more open-ended and they're just trying different things out and seeing what happens. So here's an example. So just thinking about those targeted tasks, thinking about the continuum of scaffolding, one of them is this idea of having a targeted task. And what that basically means is where you have a kind of a computer science challenge of some description that has a specific goal. It might be like a puzzle that needs to be solved. It might be a question that needs to be answered. And one example of a targeted task might be a debugging task. So this video, which we'll just have a look at now, has no sound. Hopefully it will play reasonably well. All it shows is basically a project that I made where the project is slightly broken. You move this cat around by pressing the arrow keys, but what you find when you first test the project is that the cat will move up, down and left, but it can't move right. So the idea is that you then press C inside, you have a look at the code, you check all of the different scripts, and then when you look at the arrow, the script that should make the arrow, the right arrow, make them move the cat, you will see that the direction on that block is wrong, and that it is making the cat go, I think it makes it go down instead of to the right. And then what I've also done with this project is I've kind of hidden a little Easter egg. So hidden at the bottom of this script area is a script that means that when you press the green flag, if you fix the project and you get the cat to catch the mouse, then something fun happens. And in this instance, the something fun is that when the cat touches the mouse will then move randomly, automatically around the screen, and the cat will chase it. So it's like once you've kind of done your bit of the program, it then kind of like continues itself automatically. And the reason I've kind of put that little Easter egg in there is just as really a fun way for children to sort of show that they have completed the activity. Obviously, you can ask them how they solved it, you can ask them what they changed about the program, but you can also ask them what happened when the cat caught the mouse. And if they can tell you that, it probably means that they were able to fix the code and to debug. So that's one way that you might use remixing as a way of setting a kind of targeted task and scaffolding an activity. But if we go to the next slide, there's another one as well, and this is one that this is kind of a general format, I suppose, that I've been really making a lot of use of the last year or so. So just the next slide, I think it is. So one more slide. I don't know if it's just delayed, but yeah, it's the next slide anyway. So the next one is still about remixing, but rather than being a remix where you have to debug a broken project, it's more kind of completing an incomplete project. So kind of taking a template project and then using it to make something of your own. And the example that I'm showing you here is a sort of topic-based animation activity. This is something that also for us at the CLC, and we work with lots of different primary schools, this type of activity has been quite popular over the last year. I think that is probably because of teachers knowing that they have limited amount of time with their pupils, and that also there might be some really important skills in the core subjects that need to be focused on. So doing this kind of like computing activity that really brings in other subject areas is kind of enabling schools to keep their curriculum really creative and really exciting and using technology like that, but also making sure that they're still covering the sort of cultural aspects of their curriculum. So so this particular one was an India animation. I only had a short time with the kids, so what I did before the session was I made a little template project. I did very little programming in it. I think I gave them a couple of blocks, but the main thing that I did was I added a load of pictures to the backdrops and I named them. And the naming them is maybe the most important thing, really, because if you name your backdrops effectively, it means that when you grab that block, switch backdrop to, and you click the little drop down menu, it's really easy to tell what's going to happen if you choose one of those backdrops and then you click on the block. And obviously you can test it out, and you'll find that, for example, if you choose Taj Mahal and then you click on the block, the backdrop's going to change to the Taj Mahal. And the reason I do this is partly because thinking about scaffolding and thinking about creating resources that are going to be as accessible as possible, it's really important that when the kids start to build their code, they produce code that's readable. And if the assets are all named really well, that's going to make that a lot easier. But it's also teaching that is a helpful thing to do. It's teaching good habits in programming. So you're kind of modeling good practice as a programmer. So there's like kind of two reasons that I like to do that. And then we go to the next one. I think the next one just gives you a little example of another animation, which is specifically about the Vikings. And in this animation, so it's just on the next slide, you can see how the first couple of blocks kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. So in this example, it's the background starts as a Viking building, and then the character says something about Viking buildings, and then you can switch backdrop to Viking boats, and then you can guess the character's going to say something about boats in front of a background that's got some boats. And obviously this is a very kind of simple basic structure for an animation, but there's lots more that you could do with this. You can differentiate it depending on the level of understanding or experience that the children have in Scratch. They might change their character's costume so it makes it look like their mouth is opening and closing. They might add some sound effects. There's all sorts of different things that they could do sort of with this starting point, but it's that template project that kind of makes it so that everyone starts with something that they can quite quickly turn into something that resembles a finished product. And then the next one I wanted to mention is comments. So comments are something that I think are kind of a bit of an underused feature in Scratch, really. They've been there for a very long time. I didn't used to use them as much as I do now. I think that part of the reason that they're important is because they sort of I mean, they get you into the habit of inline documentation, which when children are a bit older and they're doing text-based programming, that's going to be something that's really useful and really important for how they present their work. But there are a few different ways that you might use it as well. So as a teacher, I use comments to set tasks sometimes. So I might kind of annotate bits of script, and I might kind of use the code to make a little bit of a challenge. Maybe there's some incomplete code. Maybe there are some loose blocks that need to be sort of attached together in a particular order, and I'll use those comments to kind of indicate to the children what they need to do. So in this particular example, the task is to make a kind of Maya calendar using a series of different sprites. And so when you click on one sprite, you get given one task. When you click on the next sprite, you have a slightly different task that allows you to explore a different element of the program. Maybe go on to the next one. So the next one is also to do with comments, but this is more to do with, and this is more how you would actually use comments if you were a software developer and you were using inline documentation in your own code, simply to just explain what's happening in the code. And I think this can also be really helpful when, especially if you're teaching and you're not in the same room as the kids, basically. It means that they have access to an explanation of what's happening in the code. And you don't even have to have it be visible all the time. You can click the little drop down arrow so it's a bit smaller, and then you just open it up if you're not sure. And it's sort of a bit like being able to just ask a teacher, what does this do? Or why is it like this? So that's helpful for the child in terms of understanding what they need to do. But it can also be really helpful for the teacher in terms of understanding, or in terms of being aware of the child's level of understanding. So say, for example, you've used a template project and then you've asked the pupils to add some more blocks or create a script that does a particular job. Maybe you can ask them to comment on that script and explain what it does and explain why it does it or how it does it. I think that can be really helpful, because a lot of the time when we're teaching programming, I think something that can be really tricky is it's hard to tell from the product to the extent to which the child understands. Sometimes you might have something that doesn't quite work properly, but actually they do understand it quite well. It's just they either got bored or something just went a little bit wrong. And then sometimes you have a perfect piece of code, but actually it's because they've found a tutorial online, or maybe they've spoken to their partner, which doesn't necessarily mean they don't understand, but it's useful to have those comments just to ensure that you know that they do. And then the next thing that we've been using a lot is studios. So studios, again, this might be something that you're very familiar with, but I found myself using them a bit more and a bit differently over the past year and a half. So they're just a way of basically organizing projects. And it might be that you put all your own projects in a studio, or it might be that you collect lots of different projects along the same theme. You could even use a studio for a particular class to gather up the work from the pupils. So they have lots of different functions. They're really, really versatile and quite helpful. And we've used them a lot because we've done a few projects where we've maybe worked with several classes from the same school. So creating a single studio that has any template projects that we might need when we're working with them has made it really easy for the children to access their work. Obviously, if you're I imagine that most schools will currently be using some form of online platform that they use to share work and activities and organize things. So having a link to a studio like this that's hosted on that platform, whatever it may be, can also be a way of kind of bringing together these different ways of sharing work. And then the next one, again, this is another thing that I would say is something it's been there for a long time, but it's just a bit underused, is the My Blocks feature in Scratch. I think it's a brilliant feature, and I think it's useful for loads of reasons. I also think it's something that maybe a lot of people think that it's a bit too complicated to introduce it early, but I would disagree. I think that it's sort of I've used it with sort of year 3 before, and I've been really surprised at the extent to which they understand the concept of creating a procedure in Scratch and are able to then take that procedure and put it into a more complex program. So just to explain what the My Blocks function does, it basically gives you this big pink define block that allows you to define give a name to a script or a set of blocks. So in this instance, you can see I've made a set of blocks that says repeat 12, and then within the repeat it's going to stamp, it's going to change the colour of the sprite, and it's also going to turn 30 degrees, or make it turn 30 degrees. And when I ran that script, I thought that the resulting pattern looked a bit like a beach ball, because it started off as a strawberry and the leaves from the top of the strawberry go around the edge and it looks kind of like a beach ball. So I've used the myblocks function to define it as leafy beach ball, and I've done this activity where I've given children a project that's got just like a set of different loose blocks, and they change the numbers in the blocks and they put them together in different orders. Maybe they add some more blocks in as well, and then whatever their pattern looks like, they decide what they're going to call their block, and then they share it with their peers as well. And I think that this kind of, it gives you a real sense of sort of ownership of something that you've done. The other thing that I think it can be really helpful for is, like, so often I'll set a task like, can you make your sprite draw a square, for example, and maybe, or draw a triangle. This is the classic one. Can you make your sprite draw a triangle? And then the children will accidentally make it draw a hexagon or half a hexagon instead. But I think that it can be, so the more blocks function kind of allows you to sort of own your mistakes. So if something goes wrong and it wasn't what you expected it to be, then just give it a name. Just stick a big pink block on top of it and describe what it does, because you never know, you might need it again later. And then it allows you to kind of collect all of these different little bits of code that might come in handy when you're creating a slightly more complex project. And then we go to the next one. Of course, there's another reason that the myblocks function is really important, and it's all to do with kind of abstraction and decomposition, and really understanding what is happening in a complicated piece of code. So this isn't actually, it's another activity, a kind of targeted task activity, because it's another fix the broken project kind of activity. And in this instance, on the left hand side is what this art project is supposed to produce, and on the right hand side is what it's currently producing. So you can see that obviously it's trying to draw the scene, but something's going wrong and the tree is kind of all off to the side. But if we go to the next page, then we'll see I've made two versions of the faulty project. So 3 versions in total, the one that works and then 2 that don't work. And the first one that doesn't work basically has, and we'll see it in a second hopefully, but it basically just has every single block that produces this output, just one underneath just all in a row from top to bottom. So you can kind of scroll all the way up and down this script. It's really, really long. It programs the pencil in the project, and it's very, very difficult to read. So if you saw your kind of wonky tree and you wanted to fix it, it would be really, really difficult to pinpoint the bit of the script that you needed to actually fix the project and make it do what you wanted to do. But what I've also done is created another version of the same project. And in this version, instead of having all of the blocks in one big chunk in one script, I've broken them up into sections and I've named each of those sections. And there is actually this single script that has all of the pink blocks on it, that kind of gives you an overview of what the whole of the project does, what it's all about. So you can see that when we click the green flag, first it resets, then it draws the sky, then the sun, then the sand dunes, then the trunk, then the big leaves, and then the little leaves. So if you want to find out how a particular part of the project is drawn, you just identify the pink block, and then you look at it in its definition, and then you see whether you can fix it. So obviously with the example just now with the wonky tree, you'd need to look at the trunk block, and you'd want to be looking at the direction that the sprite starts facing in before it starts drawing the trunk. And then the last one that I wanted to talk about is the backpack. So the backpack is whenever you're logged into Scratch, it's available to you, and it just has it just says on a little bar at the bottom of the script area, backpack, and if you click it, it opens up, and this is what you see. Yeah, so in the backpack you can put all sorts of different things. You can put costumes, you can put backdrops, you can put individual scripts, or you can put whole sprites, and that kind of allows you to sort of pick and choose and pilfer a little bit from different projects that you might find online. So if you're trying to make a computer game, for example, and then you see that you play a computer game that has a bad guy that kind of moves, sort of bounces around the screen, and then when it gets you, it makes a noise or something like that, you might pop that in your backpack and you might use it in your project a little bit later on. And I think that this is also something that can be really helpful when we're thinking about kind of teaching in quite a flexible way, because, well, partly because it's important that kids know that this is okay. You might be pinching a bit of code from someone else. That is completely standard practice in the software developing community. Why would you spend time typing out a load of code if someone else has already done it and it works perfectly well? But the important thing is that you often have to tweak things slightly in order to get them to work the way you want them to. And that process of tweaking them and adjusting them, I would argue, kind of demonstrates that you do understand why it's in your project, what job it does, and how to make it work for what you're trying to achieve. So yeah, Backpack is really, really helpful. And I think that takes us to the last slide. Unless I've forgotten something, so we'll find out. Yeah. So
it's just playing now. We are out of time, unfortunately, but I can see that we've got to the end.
That's okay. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so shall I hand back to you now, Wendy, in case we have any questions before we finish?
Yes, please. Hang on. Okay, just gonna stop sharing my screen there. Okay. Unfortunately, we're out of time for questions. So if you do have any questions, I hope you have put them in the question box, because my colleague team, if you could copy those down. And I think what we'll do, as our CAS website is frozen at the moment, as we move over to the new one, which is very exciting, I think we'll ask Sarah, Rowan and Peter if they wouldn't mind responding on our CAS Facebook primary page to any questions that were posted. We'll sort of engage with our attendees there and go through the questions there, if that's okay. As unfortunately we are out of time, so I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today and bearing with us as we were going through that slide presentation. As you can see, there was a slight lag, so thank you for that. Thank you for your patience. A special thanks to Sarah, Rowan and Peter for presenting. It was so interesting what you were sharing there. And what I forgot to mention earlier is that Rowan and Peter are leaders of the CAS Lambeth community. So if you'd like to engage with them again, please feel free to join their meetings then. That would be fantastic. Please may I encourage you to share your personal highlights from today's session via social media and the CAS website. And at the end of this webinar, a short survey will appear on the screen, and we'd be grateful if you would take a minute to complete it. Please do continue to spread the word about CAS Inspire, and we're going to be hosting further CAS Inspire sessions all the way through until 2022. Our next event is secondary, is coming up on Thursday, where Claire Buckler and Thomas Land will be discussing the use of electronic exercise books in the classroom. And the next primary session will be on Tuesday, the 28th of September, and we'll be focusing on supporting the health and well-being of teachers and young children. And these sessions can be viewed and booked on the CAS website. Thank you so much for joining this afternoon, and we hope to see you next time. Goodbye.